going to kind of jump in, shift gears into your article. And this is something for those who are watching who are maybe new here. This is what we do every week. We kind of start by talking through one of the articles that this counselor, that Melissa, has written. And so this is an article that she wrote called High Female Sexual Desire When the Wife Wants Sex More. That's hard. That's really hard. I mean, just from the title alone, you're already like, whoa, that's heavy. We're getting heavy real quick. So I want to start by asking you, Melissa, who did you write this article to? You know, is it for the husband, for the wife? And what kind of inspired you to write it?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think when I was writing this in particular, I was thinking about the wives that I've worked with and the husbands too, like just to be able to understand what it's like for the wife to go through this challenge. And so, yeah, I think the different women and wives that I've worked with, I think they come in feeling like, gosh, am I the only one in the world, it feels like, that struggles with this? Because in the world that we live in, usually it's the guys complaining, right? That, man, my wife doesn't want to have sex with me, fill in the blank.
Right, and it's almost stereotyped as always being the guy.
And it's incredibly polarizing to women who do have a higher desire in the sexual relationship. It just makes them feel like, well, what's wrong with me that my husband doesn't want to have sex with me like that, you know? And where does this desire come from for me? And so anyways, I think I was just writing to those people that maybe feel like nobody gets it, or that there's not a whole lot of content out there about this, because usually it's about, you know, men that are struggling with higher desire and the female is lower desire. So yeah, I think I was just thinking about them and how hard that is, and just wanting to raise awareness that this is very much a challenge for many women, not just them, and that there's a way to navigate this to help them in their marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so good. So how common is it really for women to have maybe a higher sexual desire than their husband?
It's a great question. So statistically speaking, we know, and this is hard to really give true statistics because we can't pull every single person, but what we know is that in 10% of marriages, the woman has the higher female sexual desire, which if you think about it, 10 out of 100 people, that's a lot of people.
That's a lot.
Yeah, a lot of women feel like, man, I'm 1 in 100. I'm like the 1%, you know? So there is like probably a higher percentage than a lot of women would even know that is the case.
Yeah. And I mean, can it kind of shift, you know, like throughout, like, could it go from like the husband having that higher desire to the wife, you know, can it kind of shift, or is it just sort of like one has higher always?
Yeah. So I think as far as it changing and shifting, I think it is all relative, that it depends on the couple, right? So I think there's some situations where the female may come in having the higher desire, and then maybe she has a baby, and the postpartum hormones kind of shift her own drive and then maybe make it lower than her husband's. Or maybe something goes on in her husband's life where it takes away a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, and he has more space and energy to be able to give sexually. So I think it really does depend on what impacts the sexual desire that both of them have, right?
Right.
And that may or may not fluctuate based on those things.
Yeah, no, for sure. So at the start of your article, you actually mentioned 3 points that you kind of want women to know when they're reading this. So what are those 3 points? Can you kind of emphasize on them?
Yeah. So I think the first thing I share was just that your desire is not dirty. The reason I shared that was just because I think a lot of women feel like, well, am I just some kind of perverted woman that I have this like desire to have sex more than my husband, you know? And I think that's makes them feel like, especially in the Christian world that we live in, there's a lot of like almost, I guess you could say like shame with sexual desire itself. And then you add in, this isn't talked about a whole lot, just makes women feel like there's something wrong with them or that they're dirty or perverted in some way. I think that's the first thing I just mentioned, because I definitely get that sense, like, what's wrong with me? Like, why do I want this so much more than my husband does? This isn't normal. And then I also just wrote in there, like, it doesn't mean that you're not enough for your spouse. And I think another common challenge for women is that we base really, I think sometimes our own desirability on how much our husband wants to engage with us sexually, right? And so if he's not wanting to have sex with us, that starts making us question, like, am I attractive? Why doesn't he want me? If I were skinnier, if I, had bigger breasts, whatever, fill in the blank, maybe he would want me, maybe then I would be desirable. And it just makes them question those things a lot and makes them question their desirability. I think the last thing is just that they're not normal, because this is a normal thing for a man, not for a woman. And so,
right. I think the common theme, like the common thread in all of those things is just this like element of shame for women in this situation. Why do you think that there is so much shame around this topic for women?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of times shame comes in silence, right? Or when it's like hidden. So if you think about even in the garden, when Adam and Eve fell into sin, what did they do? They hid, and then God was coming to find them. But I think about how like that's true. Like when things are hidden and this isn't talked about a whole lot, it just produces a lot of shame. And I think if women knew how much other women were struggling with this, or, that somebody else in the room was having a hard time with this, that would actually feel really relieving to them. Like, wow, it's not just me. Maybe I'm not the broken one. Maybe this is normal. Maybe it's not as common as the 9 other women that I might be in the room with, but if I'm in the room with 100 other people, 10 other people in here would be struggling with this. So that would be, I think, huge for them to feel like I'm not broken here, or that there's not something wrong with me, because other people can relate to that. So I really think a lot of it has to do with silence about it.
Yeah. And just like opening up the conversation, really just normalizing talking about this, I think is so important, especially in the church, with wives in the church. And, you mentioned a few different things that could maybe cause some desire difference. One of the things that you mentioned is relational distress. So, why could relational distress maybe cause that disconnect in sex?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. Well, one of the things that's really significant about sex, right, is that it really makes us feel connected to each other. And when we're disconnected from each other, right, when we have relational challenges, emotionally, maybe we don't feel like the other person cares or understands us for whatever reason, like it makes us not want to engage sexually. And so it's interesting because I've known that to be the case for some men who feel a certain way in their relationship. It just makes them not want to engage with their spouse. Like, I don't want to connect with them in that way. Which I know a lot of situations, I know females feel that way too. Like, if I don't feel loved or connected, I don't want to get in bed with you. Like, I don't want to be connected to you. I think it's the same thing, just flip it around. And I think men can feel that same way as well.
Right. And that kind of goes into my next question, which is that you kind of mentioned that desire disconnect could happen just because of a husband being overly goal oriented. And, does this kind of also go into like for women as well? Could the same thing happen?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think just this, like stress, like cortisol, it just has a huge impact on our hormones and on our ability to have energy. And so if we are highly, like stressed and we have a lot of goals and we're running around all the time, like it just has a huge impact on our desire to want to engage in that way and to want to slow down and be present with our spouse sexually. And so, yeah, if their attention's being, and all of that energy is being poured somewhere else, it's going to be hard for them to want to engage in that way. Just
I've talked with Josh Spurlock about this before too, because he had an article kind of about sex and busyness and how that can kind of cause issues. And he talked about kind of the same thing, that like when you're overly stimulated and busy and crazy, things are insane, you just don't prioritize it. So going off of all of those things that can cause this desire disconnect, cause shame around sex for the wife, for the husband, all of these different things. When do you know that it's time to seek counseling, to seek professional help for, not just your relationship, but for your sex life? When do you know that that's needed?
I think when you've had this conversation so many times and everything you know to do, right? You go online, you talk to your friends, like you try to talk to your spouse and you're having the same conversation over and over for, let's say, 6 to 9 months, maybe a year. I mean, I would say at that point, if you've exhausted all of your resources, then it might be good to get help at that point, because you could spend the rest of the next 20 years of your life having the same conversation.
Yeah.
And I've actually sat with a lot of people who are in that situation where they're really, really struggling and have been struggling for a long time. And there's just so much loss of time.
Right.
By the time they come to counseling, they're like, man, had I known what I know now, how would our life have been different, or how would our sex life have been different, really? And how many fights would we have not gotten in? And so I would say when you start feeling like, gosh, we've exhausted everything and I keep banging my head against a wall and nothing's getting better.
Yeah. Yeah. So as a counselor, do you have any practical tips, practical advice for making that sexual relationship a priority?
Yeah, I think if you do have some relational tension going on, right? If there's some challenges going on with things that you're feeling about something that happened a long time ago, you're going to want to really try to work through those issues together, because they tend to pile up over time. And I usually equate this, I think I heard this from somebody at some point somewhere, but I just remember somebody telling me, like, imagine you know, pour milk on the floor and you don't clean it up. And then the next day you pour something else on the floor, you don't clean it up. And then the next day you pour something else on the floor, you don't clean it up. Eventually the kitchen becomes a place you don't want to be. Like, you don't want to sit, you don't want to be present with each other there. And so I think it really involves like taking a mop and bucket and going back and cleaning those things up. You know,
Yeah,
because
sure.
I think that if we don't clean those things up in our emotional relationship, we're probably not going to want to engage in the kitchen or in the
Right.
bedroom, you know.
Totally. And it just like piles on each other. You know, I think of like kind of going off of that cleaning analogy, like brushing your hair. You know, if you don't brush your hair and you get all these knots in your hair, it's like, well, yeah, it's going to take a long time to brush it all out because you haven't been brushing it. And, you know, you've ended up with like some dreads and different things that like, you know, are maybe not healthy.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it's really hard for couples when they get to that point, because they're like, I just want to burn the kitchen. Like, I just want to get rid of the house.
Yeah.
And they just want to get out of the marriage because it's too overwhelming
Right.
to think about working through those issues. And I think that it's very possible to work through those issues, and you might need a professional to help you with that. But I think that ultimately, when that gets cleaned up, you can enjoy being in each other's presence, and it's not, you don't have all that stuff smelly inside or around you anymore, you know?
Yeah. For
So
sure, for sure. So, you know, word of advice from you as a counselor to the wives, you know, back to that, you know, wives feeling that shame, feeling that anxiety about maybe having a higher sexual desire than their husband. You know, what advice or encouragement would you give to those wives who are maybe watching this right now?
yeah, I think one of the things I was going to share earlier was just to think about like having, maybe this doesn't sound maybe super exciting, but to think about maybe even scheduling when you guys are intimate with each other, asking your husband, like, hey, is it possible that we set a schedule, especially if it's because you guys are struggling because your husband is very busy and exhausted and overwhelmed. And the reason for that is if he knows, okay, we're going to be intimate at this time on this day, there's this like energy he can reserve for that time in your guys's day or night, whatever it is. And so I think I would encourage you to maybe just see if that was a possibility for him to be able to set a time. And I know sometimes that doesn't feel exciting, right? Because it's like, well, it's not
That was
spontaneous.
going to be my question. It's like, what
Yeah,
about
it's not
spontaneity and
spontaneous.
romance?
Yeah. And I think, you know, the Bible says there's a time for everything, right? Like there's a time for this and there's time for that. And I think there's sometimes seasons in life where spontaneity is not as feasible, right? Because we have lots of kids or we have lots of responsibilities and they're just exhausted. And so if you're in a season right now where that is the case, I would say that it would be okay that you can be spontaneous about what you do in the bedroom, but maybe just not the time, you know, and that you just look at spontaneity a little bit differently. And that you can still be spontaneous about what you do, but maybe just the time you do it is different.
Yeah.
And so I would say that. And then I would also just say that if you really are struggling with these things as well, just to really try to identify, like, what am I feeling about this? Like, what does this make me feel about myself? You know, am I feeling like I'm really alone in this? You know, am I feeling like I'm broken? I'm feeling like my husband doesn't think I'm enough. And that's why he doesn't want to have sex with me. Like, just to start, because sometimes, like, we don't really even know what's bothering us about this. We just know it doesn't feel good. And sometimes just understanding what's underneath the pain that you're experiencing and being able to put a name to it can then help you to understand, okay, what now do I need to be able to address with my husband or within me to help me to feel like I can be at peace with me or at peace with him. And what could I do or what could he do to make this better? And so I think like doing a little bit of a self-assessment of like, what is bothering me about this? And like, what do I need based on what's bothering me regarding that? So
yeah, no, that's good. That's really good advice. And, I mean, like you said before, I feel like every woman at some point maybe has felt this, maybe has felt a little bit like, ooh, I feel like I have a higher sexual desire than he does. What's wrong with me? Maybe he doesn't want me. I feel like we've all had that experience, and just shame around even just talking about it. And so I love that you are normalizing the conversation, Melissa, and really like bringing us in to talk about it. And hopefully there are wives who are watching this, who are listening to this, who are encouraged, that it doesn't have to be like this forever, that you're not stuck,
Absolutely. Yeah, I hope so too. I really do feel like I've actually taught quite a few different classes and seminars, and this is one of the things that a lot of women come up to me with. They like, hey, what about high female sexual desire? Like, what about us? Like.
Yeah. And so then I go back to like when you talked about the statistics, I'm like, there's probably so many more who don't talk about it.
Yes, it's so true. And so I definitely feel like, gosh, those women are like, and I don't know if you're watching this and you're feeling that way, but these women are really wanting help. Like they want resources and there's not a whole lot out there. Totally. And yeah, I just want to encourage you that if you're seeking help or you're seeking input, that there is help, that there is a way to work through this, both internally and with your spouse. And being able to figure out those desire differences is not easy. And yeah, just that I would love to be helpful. Somebody on our team would love to be helpful to you guys as you walk alongside in this like challenging and also like kind of polarizing journey.